In November 1838, Joseph Smith sat before a Missouri court facing some of the most serious accusations ever made against him. Far West had surrendered. Mormon families were preparing to lose their homes, and several church leaders were already prisoners of the state. Then the prosecution called its next witness. He was not a minister who hated Mormonism. He was not a Missouri vigilante, and he had not spent years attacking Joseph Smith. His name was John Corrill. 7 months earlier, Joseph Smith's church had appointed Corrill and Elias Higbee to write and keep the church history. Corrill had helped build the Kirtland Temple, worked beside the first bishop of the church, established Mormon settlements in Missouri, and represented a predominantly Mormon county in the state legislature. Now he was describing what had happened inside Far West. He spoke about secret organization, Mormon military activity, the treatment of dissenters, and Joseph Smith's growing authority. To faithful Mormons, Corrill had become a traitor at the worst possible moment. But Corrill believed he had discovered something more dangerous than persecution from outside the church. He believed that inside Far West, obedience to the prophet was beginning to replace personal conscience. How did the man selected to preserve Joseph Smith's history become a witness against him? And why, after helping the state prosecute Mormon leaders, did Corrill continue defending persecuted Mormon families? The answer is far more complicated than a simple story about belief and apostasy. John Corrill was not always Joseph Smith's enemy. In fact, when Mormon missionaries first arrived in his region of Ohio in 1830, Corrill initially rejected them. After examining part of the Book of Mormon, he concluded that the missionaries were impostors and the book was a fraud. Then Sidney Rigdon converted. Rigdon was a respected restorationist preacher, and his decision surprised Corrill. If an educated minister such as Rigdon accepted the Mormon message, Corrill wondered whether he had dismissed it too quickly. He investigated again and was baptized in January 1831. The same independent judgment that initially caused Corrill to reject Mormonism eventually brought him into it. Years later, that same judgment would lead him out. Corrill rose quickly through the church. He became a missionary, a high priest, and an assistant to Edward Partridge, the first Mormon bishop. He helped administer property and supplies as the saints attempted to establish Zion in Missouri. When the Mormons were driven from Jackson County in 1833, Corrill was expelled with them. He did not leave when following Joseph Smith became expensive or dangerous. He lost property, experienced displacement, and remained loyal. Corrill later helped with the interior construction of the Kirtland Temple. Architect Truman Angell described him as the building's leading mechanic. He also worked directly with Joseph Smith and participated in the institutional development of the church. After returning to Missouri, Corrill helped survey Far West and assisted in the creation of Caldwell County as a predominantly Mormon settlement. He became an intermediary between the saints and the state and was elected to the Missouri legislature. So when Corrill eventually testified against Joseph Smith, he was not repeating rumors from outside the movement. He knew how the church operated because he had helped operate it. Before we continue, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Mormon Files. This channel uncovers the forgotten people and conflicts that shaped Mormon history. In early 1838, the church was experiencing an internal crisis. Several important leaders had fallen out with Joseph Smith. John Whitmer, one of the 8 witnesses of the Book of Mormon, had served as church historian but was excommunicated and refused to surrender his historical records. On April 6th, John Corrill and Elias Higbee were appointed to write and keep the church history. The exact extent of their historical work is unclear, and Corrill did not remain in the position for long, but his appointment proves that, in April 1838, he was still trusted by the church. Within months, that trust would disappear. Corrill believed Mormon government originally contained several councils and offices capable of balancing one another. Joseph Smith was the prophet and president, but there were also bishops, high councils, conferences, and the voice of the general membership. Corrill believed these bodies mattered. He accepted Joseph as a prophet without believing that every decision Joseph made should automatically override councils, civil law, or personal judgment. But by 1838, Corrill had become convinced that Joseph's authority was overpowering every institutional limit. This created a conflict that neither man could easily escape. Joseph and his loyal followers believed unity under prophetic direction was necessary for the survival of the saints. Corrill believed that no religious leader should demand the surrender of individual conscience. Joseph criticized Corrill for insisting that, as a Republican, he had the freedom to believe, speak, and act according to his own judgment. For Joseph, that attitude threatened unity. For Corrill, losing that freedom would mean losing the foundation of both religious and political liberty. But this disagreement might have remained theoretical if several of Mormonism's best-known leaders had not suddenly found themselves treated as enemies. Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, John Whitmer, W. Phelps, and other prominent members came into conflict with Joseph Smith and his supporters. These were not insignificant critics. Some had helped produce the Book of Mormon, build the church, and establish the Missouri settlements. Loyal Mormons believed the dissenters were weakening the church during a dangerous period. Some disputes involved leadership, money, property, and legal authority. With outside hostility growing, criticism from former leaders looked like betrayal from within. The dissenters believed Joseph and his supporters were using church discipline to eliminate opposition. They feared that criticizing the prophet could cost them their property, political rights, and ability to remain in the community they had helped establish. Then Sidney Rigdon delivered what became known as the Salt Sermon. Using the biblical image of salt that had lost its savor, Rigdon denounced the dissenters as people who should be cast out and trodden underfoot. The sermon was followed by increased pressure on former members to leave Far West. During this tense period, a secretive organization known as the Danites appeared. Some accusations about the Danites came from former insiders who had reasons to defend themselves, so not every later allegation can be accepted without question. The precise relationship between the organization and Joseph Smith also remains debated, but Corrill believed the Danites were being used to enforce loyalty and intimidate dissenters. To him, this was the moment religious disagreement became something more dangerous. Former leaders were no longer merely losing arguments or church positions. They were being treated as threats to Zion. Corrill now faced an unsettling possibility. If men such as Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer could be transformed from founding witnesses into enemies, what would happen to anyone else who challenged Joseph? The internal crisis was unfolding while relations with non-Mormon Missourians were collapsing. The Saints had legitimate reasons to fear another expulsion. They had previously been attacked and driven from Jackson County, while government institutions repeatedly failed to protect them. Many members believed that if they did not organize for their own defense, history would repeat itself. In August 1838, violence at an election in Gallatin intensified the crisis. Rumors spread quickly, and both Mormon and non-Mormon communities began preparing for a wider conflict. Armed groups formed. Settlements expected attacks. Each side interpreted the other's preparation as evidence that war had already begun. Some Mormon operations eventually moved beyond immediate defense. Forces entered neighboring areas, confronted opponents, and participated in retaliatory or preemptive actions. Church leaders and participants later disagreed over who had authorized particular operations and what those operations were intended to accomplish. For Corrill, the critical issue was no longer whether the Saints had enemies. He knew they did. The question was whether every action taken in the name of protecting Zion had to be obeyed. As Mormon forces mobilized for operations in Davis County, Corrill believed open neutrality had become impossible. A person could not remain in the community, reject its military direction, and still expect to be viewed as loyal. He later described the position of the dissenters with one revealing sentence: "There was no other chance for me and the other dissenters but to pretend to take hold with the rest." Corrill was saying that he felt forced to appear cooperative. His statement does not prove that someone physically compelled him to fight, but it shows that he believed disagreement had become personally dangerous. This was his breaking point. Religious loyalty, political obedience, and military participation were becoming inseparable. Corrill no longer believed he could follow Joseph Smith without surrendering his right to decide which actions were morally and legally acceptable. By late October 1838, Missouri militia forces were closing in on Far West. Governor Lilburn Boggs had issued the order that became known as the Extermination Order, directing that the Mormons be expelled from the state or otherwise subdued. Far West faced an overwhelming force. Continued resistance could bring disaster upon the entire population. Corrill joined other dissenters and intermediaries in communications with state officers. He participated in the negotiations and events surrounding the surrender of Far West and the transfer of Joseph Smith and other leaders into state custody. He did not single-handedly capture Joseph Smith, but his participation was enough to define how many loyal members would remember him. From their perspective, Corrill had chosen the enemy. Missouri had allowed mobs to attack Mormon homes, failed to protect the Saints, and now intended to drive them from the state. Corrill was cooperating with the same government that had abandoned his own people. Corrill saw the situation differently. He believed surrender was the only realistic way to prevent further escalation. To him, preserving Joseph's freedom was no longer more important than protecting the wider population from an unwinnable confrontation. The disagreement could not have been more severe. Joseph's followers believed Corrill betrayed the church by assisting the surrender. Corrill believed the leadership had already betrayed its members by allowing religious authority and military power to become dangerously connected. In November 1838, the state conducted a preliminary court hearing in Richmond. Joseph Smith and other Mormon leaders faced serious accusations connected to the conflict. John Corrill testified for the prosecution. He spoke about Joseph's leadership, Mormon military organization, the Danites, and the decisions that had led to the surrender. Corrill's testimony did not prove Joseph Smith guilty. This was a preliminary hearing, not a final criminal conviction. His statements contributed to the decision to keep Joseph and some associates in custody, while additional legal proceedings were considered. Corrill must also be treated as an interested witness. He was explaining events, but he was also defending his own decision to break with the church. His proximity made him important, not perfectly neutral. Still, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. In April, Joseph's church had selected Corrill to help write its history. In November, Corrill was helping the state build a case against its prophet. The historian had become a witness. The trusted leader had become an apostate. But then Corrill did something that complicates the entire story. If Corrill had simply become an enemy of Mormonism, his next actions make little sense. In December 1838, while serving in the Missouri legislature, Corrill presented petitions seeking relief for the dispossessed Latter-day Saints. Later, after moving to Illinois, he participated in additional efforts seeking investigation or compensation for the losses Mormons had suffered in Missouri. The same man who testified against Joseph Smith was asking the government to help Joseph's displaced followers. Corrill believed several things could be true at the same time. Joseph Smith's authority had become too concentrated. Dissenters had been treated unfairly. Some Mormon military operations had crossed important boundaries, and Missouri authorities and vigilantes had also committed serious injustices against ordinary Mormon families. He rejected Joseph without defending the mobs. He criticized Mormon leaders without denying Mormon suffering. That distinction prevented either side from fully claiming him. Faithful members could see him as a traitor, but he continued defending their civil rights. Missouri officials could use his testimony, but he refused to justify the expulsion of the saints. In 1839, Corrill was formally excommunicated in his absence. That same year, he published a short history of the church explaining both its doctrines and his reasons for leaving. It was not a furious attack on Mormonism. Corrill described his conversion, explained the church's beliefs, acknowledged the persecution of the saints, and then documented the developments that caused him to lose confidence in Joseph Smith. He was writing history, but he was also defending himself. John Corrill died in 1842, only a few years after publishing his account. He never returned to the church. Today, his history is preserved by the same religious tradition that excommunicated him. It remains valuable because Corrill stood at the center of the Missouri crisis without fitting comfortably into either side's version of events. He had helped build Zion, but later rejected the authority directing it. He helped arrange the surrender of Far West, but continued defending displaced Mormons. He testified against Joseph Smith without becoming an ally of the Missouri mobs. His break was not primarily about archaeology, the Book of Mormon, or one disputed doctrine. It was about how much authority a prophet should possess, and what a believer should do when loyalty to a religious leader conflicts with personal conscience. Joseph Smith's church appointed John Corrill to preserve its history. Instead, Corrill preserved the story of how one of its trusted leaders came to believe that obedience was demanding too much. So was John Corrill a traitor who abandoned Joseph Smith during the church's greatest crisis? Or was he a principled insider who recognized that loyalty had begun replacing freedom? Share your perspective respectfully in the comments. And if you want more forgotten stories about the people who shaped and challenged early Mormonism, like this video and subscribe to Mormon Files.